Casa Lupita is Spanish for Lupita's house. But this is a restaurant, not a house, and it belongs to Richard Greene, not Lupita. Richard Greene isn't even Mexican, but that's all right, because Lupita was, and Lupita gave more than her name to this restaurant. Casa Lupita has its roots in a small truck stop Mexican restaurant, which sat 40 people inside and had them lined up outside waiting to get in. That's where Richard Greene's partner found Lupita, cooking the best Mexican food he'd ever eaten at Lupita's Restaurant and Tamale Factory.
And she would come out of the kitchen, and she'd come all in her whites, and she'd been working, and she'd walk around and she'd shake everybody's hand, and she'd tell everybody why, you know, what went into her food, and she wouldn't give away the recipe, but she'd tell them that when they came into her restaurant, they were coming into her home. It was her heart that began the restaurant.
Richard Greene and his partner Alan Russak worked out a deal with Lupita and her husband Ed. They got the rights to use Lupita's name. She got a brand new restaurant with a different name. And thrown into the bargain, Richard and Alan got Lupita's recipes, the hard way.
See, she'd go along and she'd take a handful of this, a handful of that, and take the salt, and take the cumin and oregano and garlic, and she'd wrap the tamales. And so I'd go behind and I'd write down this. I said, no, Lupita, what's a handful? I'd take a handful and I'd measure it out. And then it was like that. It was incredible to get her to give, even though she wanted to give the recipes and wanted to work with us, it was like pulling her continually because she thought she was always going to be around.
But the tragedy of this story is that Lupita didn't get to enjoy her new beginning for very long. 10 days after Casa Lupita opened, Lupita died, but not without having made a lasting impression on those who knew her. Richard has saved a picture of one of the signs that hung in the original Lupitas. Your satisfaction is our responsible. We'll always try to tell the true and never try to foolish you. Casa Lupita is undeniably successful, and Richard thinks that would have pleased Lupita. Just how successful, Richard wouldn't say, but successful enough to allow him to pursue a hobby of poetry from his deco-style home in West Seattle. Poetry isn't necessarily an expensive hobby, unless you publish it yourself, which can, and did in this case, cost $5,000. But Harlequin Masks is more than the poetry of Richard Greene. Meet his collaborators.
Well, firstly, this is Marilyn Moffat.
Hello.
How do you do? My ex-wife of 14 years ago, Joelle de La Fontaine. And the other poet is my mother.
Well, I've been a flight attendant for 14 years. And right now I'm researching alcohol and drug treatment centers to set up an employee assistance program. And poetry, though, presses forward whether I want it to appear or not. I mean, I can be driving and it'll come through and I've got to write it right there. It's no choice. It'll happen on the plane also. In the middle of serving everybody, all of a sudden I'll look at someone and have to run off and write something down. So it's pretty major there, but it's not the bread and butter.
I've done a lot of commercial art, which I've completely stopped doing because when I did commercial art, I didn't do any of my own, which is to me far more important. So to make a living, I'm a waitress.
Harlequin Mask. A harlequin is a sad clown. It was used theatrically in one sense. In another sense, like the fool or the court jester, it could take on the guise of a fool and it could express what the multitudes think. It could express all kinds of things wearing this costume behind the mask, and it wouldn't get its head cut off.
There are those of you who might ask why a successful restaurant owner publishes poetry. And aside from the fact that Harlequin Masks is selling rather well, Richard Greene has an answer.
Every restaurateur should publish many books of poetry. Then people will talk about poetry and literature versus talking about restaurants and recipes that they know.